right now. My goal for this discussion, it's not going to be much of a discussion, it's going to be a bit of a monologue from me with an opportunity for some Q&A afterwards from you guys, is that we can hopefully maybe end this session with everybody agreeing that this phrase, everybody is entitled to their own opinion, practically useless. Like has almost no business being in this class, probably doesn't do a whole lot outside of this class either, and that there are better ways, to the extent that there are like respectable sentiments behind this idea that everybody has a right to their own opinion, there are better ways of getting at it. So if things go well, if things go according to my plan, I prefer that they go well as opposed to according to my plan. If my plan isn't very good, let's not do the plan, let's do something else, right? But if things go according to my plan, and if the plan is good, we'll end this with everybody kind of agreeing that next time somebody goes, everyone's entitled to their own opinion in class, we'll all just like make a big farting noise and be like, nope, that's nothing. Like, we don't really need to respond to this. Or we'll have more intelligent things to say besides this that are trying to get at the same idea. Is that Olivia?
Yes.
Question?
Say it might be relevant if you're talking about your taste, like with what ice cream flavor.
It might be relevant if we're talking about taste. That's going to come up at a certain point. I don't even necessarily really want to get into that. And like, I definitely think that like a big mistake that I made on Friday was I wandered into this fact opinion territory when it was a little bit of a tangent. So like, I'm going to see if I can do my best to not do that today. So where we started on Friday was this question, everybody's entitled to their own opinion. What does it mean? Is it true? Now, near as I can tell, we've got three major, judging from the conversations that we had on Friday, the other class on Friday, and the discussion boards for the online class, I think I was able to identify three major interpretations of what it is that this phrase means. And the first one seems to somehow be related to this idea that somehow everyone's entitled to their own opinion is close to, or like is reaching for the same sort of thing as our right to free speech that's codified in the First Amendment. Now, one of the things that seems like a significant drawback in this is that it just seems like it misses the mark just enough to say that it's not a relevant comment, or whether or not we have a First Amendment right to free speech doesn't really seem to have anything in particular to do with this supposed right to one's own opinion. I get where it's coming from, by the way, that if you have a right to say whatever you want, presumably you have a right to believe it as well, right? You're just, all speech is expression of opinions. So it's almost as if the right to free speech is a bigger right, or it's a more stringent right, or places more stringent duties upon us than a right to one's own opinion. But we should point out this. The First Amendment only, and can you guys even read that in this light? Even in the back? Ace. Also, these are online, so if you want to follow along on tablet, phone, laptop, at home, that's fine too. The First Amendment only protects us from government interference with our ability to express ourselves. And we've got it right here. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's it. That's the First Amendment. It says that the state can't put you in jail for saying things, or it can't fine you for saying things. We know that this is false as well. Even if we're thinking about like a really robust First Amendment right, are we all familiar? There are significant exceptions to the First Amendment as well. Forms of speech that even the Supreme Court has said like, yeah, the First Amendment doesn't protect that. So threats to public safety, yelling fire in a crowded theater, that sort of stuff, nope. You're not at liberty to do that. Obscenity. That's a kind of a surprising one. We don't see that, so I guess it depends on what field you're in. Art ends up dealing with a lot of these obscenity cases, these questions of whether something is obscene or artistic. You don't see obscenity so much in, say, like newspapers. What you do see with newspapers and journalists is conflicts with kind of like public safety, national security, conflicts with national security. The Supreme Court has said over and over and over again that a journalistic right to free press doesn't extend to cover threats to national security. So you can't leak, for example, positions of our troops so that everybody can read it and be like, but people need to know. The Supreme Court's going to end up saying, like, people did not need to know that. It was incredibly dangerous. And the state can engage in prior restraint and stop you from using that sort of speech. In addition to that, we have libel and slander laws. You can be published after the fact for saying plenty of things. If you say something that's false and derogatory towards somebody in speech or in print. So, A, there are exceptions to the First Amendment. B, the First Amendment only has to do with the government and the way that it punishes people's speech. It has nothing to do with the sorts of interactions between private citizens. And I don't know about you, but whenever I've heard somebody say, I have a right to my opinion, they're not talking to some government agent who's trying to jail them for what they've said. The context is, two people were in a disagreement publicly. And the disagreement was going back and forth, and one of them just said, like, well, everybody has a right to their opinion. Not as if, like, don't jail me, bro, or don't brainwash me, bro, or don't fine me for just speaking my mind, bro. Like, none of that stuff. It's just been kind of, I don't, like, whatever it is, it ain't this. Is that clear? So if this is one of the interpretations that seems to be bouncing around for, like, what it is that having a right to one's opinion might mean, that it means the same thing as the First Amendment, clearly it doesn't mean the same thing as the First Amendment. And just because the First Amendment is true, just because we have a legal right to free speech in all of these ways, does not necessarily mean that we have some kind of more diffuse right to our opinion that governs the way that we interact with other private citizens. Yes? That's fine. That's a starting place. Yeah.
If everyone believes that you have a right to your own opinion, is it not kind of like a social like, culture thing? Like it's kind of like because everyone accepts it, therefore everyone kind of has.
Yeah, that the right is not a natural right, not even a legal right. It's just a fact of the way that people act, right? If we all act as if everybody has a right to their own opinion, then everybody will have a right to their own opinion. So what is that right again? Is it this? Is it protection from legal sanction? Is it protection from like public disagreement? Because this is what I get sometimes. I don't know if this popped up on Friday in our discussion, but I see this over and over again from family members. Oh, it's hard. Family members are the hardest. On social media, where they'll say something that I'm just like, oh, that's wrong, like demonstrably wrong. And I'll pop onto their Facebook page and like right underneath their post, I'll be like, that's wrong, here's a source. And they'll come back at me with, everybody's got a right to their own opinion. Is this a relevant comment to make? Just an attempt to save face, perhaps? Yeah. Say that, like, I have a legal right to say what I just said. I wasn't challenging their legal right. I wasn't like, you're not allowed to say that. I'm saying, you're wrong to say that. Oh, but I'm legally allowed to. Or maybe it's a social convention that I'm allowed to say whatever I want. And I'm like, well, very well. Yeah, I'm not trying to stop you from saying what you want. I'm not even trying to punish you for having said what you wanted to say. But Jamie White points this out pretty well. If you've got your right to your own opinion and to express it, right? Whether this is a social convention or whether this is a legal right or maybe even a natural right that exists regardless of whether or not state organs sort of recognize it. I've got that right too, right? We've all got that right. When somebody says, I have a right to express my opinions, and they say this to me on social media because I criticize them, there's a big part of me that wants to come right back and say like, and so do I. What's your point? It's as if it's just not relevant. I was bringing up this question of whether or not what they said was accurate or correct or true or a good belief to have. And they responded, I have a legal right to say this, which doesn't, can we all agree that having a legal right to do something doesn't mean that it's a good thing to do? Okay. And I think we did mention this on Friday. If that's the best defense you have for an opinion that you have, is that technically I can't be put in jail for sharing it or for having it, that's weak sauce. Super weak sauce, right? If that's the best you can say, that's not good for your opinion. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and say that this interpretation, it just doesn't get at what the phrase seems to be trying to do. It seems irrelevant. If this is what everybody has a right to their own opinion means, then whenever they say it, it just seems like a red herring, a non sequitur, something designed to kind of like take us off track of what we were talking about and on to some other irrelevant thing or tangential thing. Okay. This one, Not crazy about it. Let's try another one. Let's try this possible interpretation, which is totally more suited, I think, like way better suited to the sort of context in which everyone's entitled to their own opinion is used. And it seems to be this kind of vague implication that everybody's beliefs or everybody's opinions are equally good. I think we talked quite a bit about this one on Friday, so I'm not going to belabor it too much. But what do we think of this idea that everybody's beliefs are equally good? No matter what belief you hold, if it's yours, then that's a good belief for you to hold. No such thing as bad beliefs. No such thing as at least like better and worse beliefs or better and worse opinions. I could rattle off a couple of examples real quick that I think a lot of people would kind of bristle at, right? Just on its surface, like at face value, this seems to not be true. We could start with like, hey, I like to kidnap and torture young children, and I think that that's a morally acceptable thing to do. And you say, well, I have a very different opinion about that. And I'm like, well, we're all entitled to our own opinions, and your belief is equally good as mine. We might be like, I don't know about that. I don't think those two beliefs are equally good. This might extend to things like, I don't know, like whether the Anderson .Paak record last year was better or worse than the Kanye West record. I think, have you guys ever like been in a discussion about this, about like what's the better album or what's the better band or what's the better movie or something like this? We talked a little bit about this with respect to issues of taste, but I don't know, like on some issues, like I'll stand and fight. Like I'll say it for sure that like, I'm trying to think of somebody that like we can all plausibly agree. Like Beyonce is better than Chief Keef. And anybody who says differently doesn't understand music very well. It's different music? Yeah, that is, yeah, maybe apples, oranges, hard to compare. Yeah, we could say that. I could say that apples are better than oranges, and some people are like, I prefer apples to oranges. But I do, even though that somebody might say, well, they're trying to do very different things, I think I might still stick on this and say that, like, yeah, and you might not agree with me. We might not actually be able to settle this dispute. It might be that at the end of the conversation, nobody really changes their mind. But something's on the line, right? Is Kobe better than LeBron, or is LeBron better than Kobe? Like, people will fight over this, and it doesn't seem meaningless. It's not just people spinning their wheels. Something's on the line. People care about it in this way where you're not just talking about, I agree, vanilla ice cream, chocolate ice cream, like which one's the best? Sometimes this is silly. What makes good art? Not necessarily something silly. What constitutes good moral behavior? Not necessarily a silly debate to have. And not necessarily the sort of thing that I think that when I say you shouldn't murder people, I just mean I'd prefer that you don't. I mean that it's actually bad and ought not be done. And people who disagree, I think they're wrong. We also have other territory where we might talk about like the Earth is flat versus the Earth is an oblate spheroid. Like, are those two beliefs equally good? I don't really think so. 2 + 2 = 4 versus 2 + 2 = 5. Are those two beliefs equally good? No, I don't think so. And some of you might be thinking to yourself that some of these are easier to prove than others. But I want to kind of like point a couple of things out. Whether or not we can prove something, or whether or not I can convince other people to agree with me, those two are, can we all agree that those two aren't exactly the same thing? Proving something and getting people to agree with me, it would be nice if I proved it, then everybody would be like, oh, I get it, I agree. But sometimes you prove something and people are like, la, 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 just not paying attention. You can prove something without necessarily convincing people. But even if I can't convince people, even if I can't prove it, this seems to have almost nothing to do with whether or not something is true. Which is to say, there can be things that are true or false, whether I know them or not. Does that seem about right? But just not be sure that it's right, right? Yeah, we could have a whole collection of opinions about like what's going on. For example, here's one where I think, at least for now, none of us would be able to say for sure who was right. Let's say I think later this week it's going to snow in Greensboro. And you might be thinking to yourself like, ooh, I don't know about that. And like, can we tell right now who's going to be right? Is one of us right? Yeah, there's a truth of the matter that just hasn't revealed itself yet, right? And whether or not those statements or those opinions are true or false seems to have to do with whether or not it actually snows later this week, and nothing to do with what I believe or what you believe or what anybody believes. It has nothing to do with whether or not there's a disagreement about any of these matters as well. What we have here on the presentation slide is something that's kind of getting at the same idea. The mere fact that somebody believes something doesn't tell me anything about whether that belief is good. It only tells me that that belief is theirs, that they have it. I believe it. Okay, so that's your belief. Does that make it good? Does that make it true? No. Whether or not the belief is yours has nothing to do with whether it's true. Whether it corresponds to reality, perhaps. Whether it corresponds to the facts, if we want to use that word without getting into a whole different conversation. If it corresponds to the way that things really are, perhaps then we'll say it's true. But whether it's true or not seems to have nothing to do with whether I believe it. If it did, if my believing something made it true, then I'd always be right and I'd never be mistaken. And that seems to conflict with my experience. I've been mistaken many times. Same thing going on with this fact of disagreement. Just because people disagree about something doesn't mean that, well, it doesn't mean anything except that they disagree, right? Just because people disagree doesn't mean that there's no truth of the matter. It's entirely possible that the disagreement is produced by the fact that one of the disputants is correct and one of the disputants is incorrect. Could be that all of the disputants are incorrect. Everybody's got it at least a little bit wrong. It could be that there's no truth. It could be that there's multiple truths. That everybody gets their own separate reality, right? That I've heard this before, and it makes me kind of wonder how these people go through the world exactly. But sometimes folks will say something like, well, that's my truth. Or it's my beliefs are my truth. They correspond to my reality. You may have a different reality. To which I usually respond, if one person believes that the earth is flat and another person believes that the earth is round-ish, an oblate spheroid, are they living on completely different planets? Is there like a flat earth in one universe and a rounder earth in the other, and one person lives in the universe with the flat earth? Or do they both live on the same planet and they just have different perspectives on it? That first option seems pretty wild, and it seems like there's nothing to support it. There's nothing to drive us to this idea that everybody gets their separate reality. Kittens are cute. Lots of kittens? Great. Lots of puppies? Great. Like as many as possible, please. Get them into the room. Truth? One, please. Just one truth. Thanks very much. Reality? Same thing. Just one. Not everybody gets their own separate one. Does that seem plausible? Like less enthusiastic nodding on this one. I lost you just a little bit? Okay. Let me see if I can recap real quick. Just because people disagree doesn't mean that, well, it doesn't mean anything about the truth of what anybody's saying, right?
They could just be fighting for completely different reasons. Like, they actually just hate the person. They just want to disagree.
Could be that somebody's lying, right? They're not even saying things that they actually believe. That's always a possibility. Although, I try not to assume that until somebody gives me really good evidence. Bad things happen when you start thinking that people are lying. Does that make sense? Just because there's a disagreement doesn't mean anything. And just because I believe something doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't make it true for me, whatever the hell that means. True to me, perhaps, seems true to me, but that's a little bit different than is true for me. Right? Okay, fair enough. Just in case anybody's still kind of like a little bit uncertain about this idea that some beliefs are better or worse than others, let's just get at this kind of maybe this is a different sort of argument, this idea that beliefs aim at truth. This is what it means to have a belief, is I think something is true. And if beliefs are, in fact, aiming at truth, if that's true, that beliefs aim at truth, then it would seem that all other things being equal, true beliefs are better than false beliefs. Does that seem plausible? If I was struggling to come up with a way to tell the difference between better and worse beliefs, one way to do that is to say the true ones are better than the false ones, all other things being equal. Now this doesn't address whether or not there might occasionally be some circumstances where a noble lie is a good idea, to tell kids that the tooth fairy brought them money, or that Santa Claus brought the presents, or that the dog went to a big farm like out in the country where it gets lots of room to run and play. Sometimes lies are helpful lies, but this is why I say all other things being equal. If there's no extra utility to saying something that's false, then I would say that a true belief is better than a false belief. And on that note, we get something that we haven't talked about yet. Something that's actually fairly important. This is like our first rule. I'm going to go ahead and say, like, let's see if we can all agree that this is a rule that we can all follow, that we'll all try to follow. Not just this semester, but elsewhere as well. The rule is known as the law. I went ahead and, did I call it the law? Yeah, let's call it the law. Sometimes people call it a principle instead of a law. But let's go big. Let's swing for the fences. The law of non-contradiction, which gets at this idea that if we're talking about whether or not some beliefs can be better or worse than others, beliefs that are consistent are better than beliefs that are inconsistent. And this starts to get into like collections of beliefs. If I have a whole, and you have more than just one belief bouncing around in your head, right? You got a whole bunch of them. If some of those beliefs conflict with one another, that's a problem. And if I can express one belief in one sentence that contradicts itself, something very, very bad is going on. The way that the law of non-contradiction, or the principle of non-contradiction, is frequently articulated is to say that A and not A can't both be true at the same time and in the same respect. We have to fill in some content for A there, right? Whatever A is. And the interesting thing about the law of non-contradiction is it doesn't matter what A is. Whatever A is, A and not A can't both be true at the same time and in the same respect. So let's try this out on a couple of things. Adam is tall, and Adam is not tall. Can Adam be both tall and not tall at the same time? I can grow, right? So like at different times I can be not tall and then later tall, or tall and then shrink and get less tall. But also we might say something like, compared to my grandmother, I'm tall. Compared to almost anybody else, I'm not. So I'm both tall and not tall at the same time? In the same respect? Yeah, not in the same respect. When we talk about measuring against different people, this would mean in different respects, right? So we might also make it about something like, oh, well, Adam is alive. Adam is alive and not alive. Can I be both at the same time? Yeah, at different times, I can be like alive one moment and not alive some other moment. It happened when I was born. One moment I wasn't alive yet. Well, all right, that's a different, before I was conceived. One moment I wasn't alive, and then sometime later, at time t, I was alive. And then at some very, very sad point in the future, hopefully the distant future, I'll go from being alive to not being alive. But not at the same time. And perhaps I get hit by a bus, and I'm brain dead in the hospital, lying there with machines helping me breathe and helping my heart beat. Am I alive? In a way. Am I not alive? Maybe also in a way, right? We might say the body is still alive, still doing its thing, so he is alive in that sense. But the person we all know and love, he's gone. So in another sense, he's not alive. Adam's both alive and not alive at the same time, but not in the same respect, right? Might also do it with like in the room, out of the room, right? Adam's in the room at time t. At time t plus 1, boom, out of the room. At different times I can be in and out. I can be like this and say, well, in one sense I'm in the room, in another sense I'm out of the room. Can I be both in the room and not in the room at the same time and in the same respect? I just got to figure out what it means to be in the room, right? As long as I can use that concept consistently, there's no way I'm going to be both in and not in the room at the same time and in the same respect. This popped up at the end of the discussion. I talked with some folks about how at the same time might be a little bit wonky. If you're like a physics junkie, you might say like simultaneity is actually something that's relative to your inertial frame of reference. Yeah, okay, I'll grant that. At the same time gets really, really weird when you start doing like relativistic physics. True. And at the quantum level, sometimes it looks like maybe like something is both a particle and a wave at the same time, or it's both here and someplace else at the same time. Is that the same as here and not here? Is that the same as a particle and not a particle? I don't know, but those are very, very strange sorts of circumstances. I will say that one of the reasons why this gets called a principle rather than a law is that there are some weird little corners of the universe and small communities of scholars who are kind of thinking about, like, we're not sure if this applies all the time. But in ordinary, everyday sort of conversation, if we're talking about using language in a competent way, it's considered very, very bad form to contradict yourself within the same sentence. Such that we might say, I don't even have to know if Adam is alive or not alive. If anybody ever said Adam is both alive and not alive at the same time and in the same respect, I would be, that sentence is false. Would you agree with me? Anytime anybody says Adam's both alive and not alive at the same time and in the same respect, we would be able to say, I don't even know this Adam guy, whether he's alive or not, but that shit right there, that was false. And a bad belief. It's bad to believe contradictory statements. If we can have at least one sort of opinion that we could say, like, that's a terrible opinion, then suddenly this idea that, like, all opinions are equally good, zip, 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 there's lots of stuff you can go back. This idea that all beliefs are equally good is clearly out the window. Even if we only were looking at contradictory, self-contradictory beliefs, we would be able to say, like, those aren't very good. So this one kind of falls a little bit flat, too. We had the First Amendment approach, and we had this approach. I'm not impressed with either one of them. Are we good so far? Following along? I haven't said anything that you're like, oh, I really disagree with that. Let's get our last one. The last one, and we did mention this on Friday, is this idea that people don't mean it literally. When they say everybody's entitled to their own opinion, they just mean something else. It's a non-literal sort of utterance. And people like Jamie White or people like me who try to, like, analyze all the little bits and pieces of the statement, we're just completely missing the point. This is not meant to be taken literally. It's meant figuratively, which then raises this new question of, like, all right, if it's not literal, what does it mean? And we encountered a couple of different possibilities. One is to say, I'm done talking. It's just a way of ending the conversation. I'm tired. I've been trying to give you good reasons. You're not really listening to my reasons. But it doesn't really seem like this is productive. I'm not getting anything out of it. You're not getting anything out of it. I'm hungry. It's getting dark. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. Which I get. I totally get that appeal. That makes perfect sense that sometimes that needs to be done. I do think if you want to end a conversation, probably just better to say, let's end the conversation. Like, say what you mean, instead of futzing around with this everybody's entitled to their own opinion shit and getting me worried, like, and Jamie White worried, like, what are they talking about? If you just want to end the conversation, say so. Hopefully, polite, respectable people will be like, all right, I get it, go on. Meaner people will be like, oh, you're just giving up because you know you're beaten. Fuck them. But, like, what are you going to do? The other thing, and actually I kind of get that response too, because sometimes people do this as well, right? They bug out of a conversation when it gets too hard by saying everybody's entitled to their own opinion. This is sneaky and dishonest in a way that I've got a real problem with, because it seems to represent itself as being somehow open-minded and tolerant. Like, look at how nice I am, letting everybody else have their own opinions. I'm not judging them. I don't think I've ever met anybody that actually sticks to that in all cases, mostly because there's, like, you know, you can try to murder them, and they'll be like, oh, I don't like that. And you're like, that's just your opinion, right? And they're like, no, I think it's actually true. Or we might say something like, Rosenfeld decides that he's just going to grade arbitrarily for the rest of the semester. He's going to, like, he just kind of does a random, like, spin a roulette wheel for each student to decide what their grade is. And in fact, I've already done it, and sorry, but you're going to fail this semester. Like, you're one of the people that ended up with an F. Like, there's nothing you can do for the rest of the semester. You're totally getting an F. And that's a good way, a good and fair way to assign grades, he said earnestly, sharing his opinion with everybody. But that doesn't seem really respectable, right? That doesn't seem like the sort of thing that you could tolerate. I have yet to meet anybody who's actually capable of tolerating all sorts of opinions. They might, at the very least, get stuck in this question of, like, should we or should we not tolerate other people's opinions? If they say that they're going to tolerate all opinions, does that include we shouldn't tolerate all opinions? Does that make sense? Like, for example, the person who says, you should always be tolerant, I say, like, what about intolerance? How do you feel about that? Are you tolerant of intolerance? Or are you intolerant of intolerance? Seems like either way, you fucked yourself. Like, there's no way to, like, hold on to this belief that you should be tolerant about everything. Maybe this is a good guideline because we have a tendency to be too intolerant. But a more plausible response to this would be like, tolerate the tolerable things, don't tolerate the intolerable things, and let's all agree that the hard part here is trying to tell the difference between the tolerable things and the intolerable things. To just call it all stuff that should be tolerated seems a bit lazy, and I think that's a problem with both of these kind of non-literal interpretations. They seem a little bit lazy, or there's at least the potential for being lazy. Sometimes folks will just say, I don't want to talk about this anymore because they've just given up. And sometimes that makes sense, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it is legit laziness. And this defense mechanism approach, where it's just kind of like, I'm going to pretend like I'm tolerant of everybody, but really what I want is protection from other people's criticism. And I'll say everybody's entitled to their own opinion in this way of saying, like, you go think what you think, no one's going to change my mind. It's a little bit dishonest. It's pretending to be tolerant when what you really want is... It's pretending to be open-minded when in fact it's a way of being very closed-minded and not letting anything challenge your beliefs. And it's a little bit cowardly to say that I'm not going to expose myself to criticism. For fear of what? That you might realize that you're wrong? It's uncomfortable to realize that you're wrong about something, but would you prefer to continue to be wrong? Growth isn't always pleasant. Things that are good for you aren't always pleasant. Medicine tastes terrible. Very good for you, though, in the right circumstances. Education, not entirely pleasant, but presumably good for you. That seems to be the understanding, whether it's true or not. Folks are willing to shell out large quantities of money to what? Be unhappy? Why would you do this if you didn't think that there was some benefit to it at the end? So yeah, these seem like they're kind of distinctly anti-intellectual. They're not really open-minded. They pretend to be open-minded when really it's a way of being closed-minded. It's lazy. It's cowardly. It's dishonest. I'm not crazy about these either. None of these options, with the possible exception of I'm tired and it's dark and this conversation needs to end, in which case I'd say just say that instead of everyone's entitled to their own opinion. Yes?
So is it wrong to say, like, if we're in a discussion about a topic, is it wrong for me to say I'm willing and open to hear what you think about it, but I'm firm in what I believe in, and whatever you say isn't going to sway me?
How do you know that whatever they say isn't going to sway you unless you've heard what they have to say? Yeah.
Is it wrong to automatically...
I think that might be a little...
Come with that approach firsthand, and automatically, like, my belief is my belief.
I'm not going to change it, no matter what. Yeah. I think that that's a little too close-minded. And we'll get, like, at some point in this, not today necessarily, but we will, don't worry. We will eventually get to this question of, like, the beliefs that you already have, they seem to have an advantage over the ones that you haven't heard yet. So if somebody comes to you and says, like, let me tell you something completely different, it's going to change the way you think about everything, you might be inclined to say, like, this had better be good. If I'm going to change my mind, it's got to really wow me. I'm setting the bar really much higher for this new idea than I would for the idea that I already believe. To some extent, this is perfectly natural and a good idea. This is like a rational way of dealing with your beliefs. To another... In another way, it's kind of a natural psychological bias that we have that sometimes leads us astray. We'll talk about how to balance those two things at some point. But I will say, to say that you're never going to change your mind about something, that seems like some false confidence. Like, the reasons you have for believing it had better be, like, really amazing. And to say it before you've heard the counter-argument, that seems... Yeah. I'm not going to say it's always going to be wrong to do that, but I think I will say that, like, ooh, it would make me raise my eyebrows to hear somebody say, nothing you could say will change my mind. Unless it was something like, oh, I don't know. There are some things that I think I could believe. Like if I said, I love my wife, and you said, like, I don't think you do. And I'm like, I'm willing to hear the reasons that you have, but I'm pretty sure you're not going to be able to convince me about this. But maybe this has to do with the question of like, who's got access to the relevant sort of evidence for whether or not I love my wife, right? As I feel like I've got pretty good access to that. I have no idea if you have good access to it. But one of the things might be, you might say something like, you believe that you love your wife, but in fact, you have no idea what love is. Have you been in this position before, or known somebody who's been in this position before? They're totally convinced that they're in love, and you're just like, you just listen to a lot of pop songs. You're not really in love. If you were really in love, you would do X, Y, and Z. You just say that you're in love, but you don't, you don't support them, you don't listen to them, you cheat on them. I find it difficult to believe that you love them. Even if you say it, and even if you believed it, I might think that you're mistaken about being in love. So even then, it seems like there's always like a way in to kind of undermine what's going on. Such that if you completely shut out the possibility of ever changing your mind, I think that might be a little bit rash. Yes?
So what about the circumstances where the belief that they hold is based on faith, and maybe not necessarily based on factors of one of religion or other?
Yeah. That's a very special way of fixing belief. Did this come up on Friday? Did we talk about faith at all?
Yeah, because actually faith and belief are kind of the same thing.
Yeah, faith is a way of coming to a belief, but it seems like it necessarily has to be outside of the sort of evidence that you can share. So, and will we talk about this? I think maybe we will. When we talk about science and pseudoscience, we'll talk a little bit about this, about whether or not these can be sorts of things that would be reasonable to believe, but not reasonable to expect other people to agree with us, right? So if the reason why I believe in God is that I have had a first-person mystical experience, I felt the presence of the divine, and I was like, that was totally God. And you say something like, maybe it was gas, maybe it was those mushrooms that you ate, maybe like it could have been there are all sorts of possible explanations. And I'll be like, I don't think so. This felt like a sort of like an undeniable experience. Then I think we might be at an impasse here. We might kind of recognize that this is not the sort of thing that we can speak sensibly about because we're not sharing the same sort of evidence. You just don't have access to it. And this is ultimately, like, I think where I fall on matters of religious faith. It's one of those things where, like, if I had that experience, I totally get that I would probably change my mind. If I haven't had that experience, I totally get why I might be suspicious of other people. Religious faith is a very, very difficult, if not impossible thing to, like, bring people with differing opinions together on. Historically, the way that we've settled disagreements about religious faith is we just killed the other people. I think there's a better way of solving disputes.
That sort of goes back to what you were saying about tolerance. I can tolerate you having a different faith than I do.
Yeah. But if your
I
faith,
agree with
if your faith involves the ritual sacrifice of, like, neighborhood cats, then I think I might say something like, ooh, yeah, like, I think maybe we have a right to step in and say, like, those religious practices, at least, and maybe not the beliefs, but maybe the practices need to be curtailed. Yeah, sure. All right. So again, we come back to this question that White introduces. He gives us this kind of mechanism for analyzing this question of, like, what would it mean to say that you have a right or you're entitled to your own opinions, and is that even true? He asks us to look at, like, what sort of duties would come with this, and what would count as a violation of this supposed right. And judging on the way that people use this phrase, it seems like the sorts of duties or the violations that people have in mind are when people come back at them, right? If I say, like, this is what I believe, and somebody goes like, I think that's wrong, I'll be like, you're trying to violate my right to my opinion by telling me that I'm wrong? Seems like that's what's going on. But if we ask about, like, the sorts of duties that the rest of us have, if I believe something, do you have a duty to agree with me? Like a legal duty? A moral duty? Any duty whatsoever? Can I say duty a couple more times?
Yeah.
You don't have a duty to agree with me? Do you have a duty to respect my belief, even if you don't agree with it? Keep in mind, my belief might be You should fail the class because of how I rolled the dice. My belief might be it's good to torture little children. My belief might be 2 + 2 = 5. Do you have to respect it? Do you have any duty whatsoever? No. Do you have any duty to silence yourself and not express any disagreement with my belief? Because you yourself also have like First Amendment rights and you're entitled to your opinion as well, perhaps? Yeah, something like that. So what sorts of duties are there that are associated with this? And if there's, oh yeah, do we have something in mind? Yeah.
Maybe a duty to consider it for however long it may be.
Consideration, yeah. Politeness maybe as well, right? I think a lot of folks, they get their dander up about having the right to their opinions or being entitled to their opinions when they feel that somebody is being rude or harassing them, right? And I think there's something there. I think there's like a deep nugget of truth or like a nugget of something respectable deep at the heart of everybody's entitled to their own opinion. And just like clumsy people who don't really understand how to use words right turned this very respectable thing into this very weird thing. We might say something like this. It's good to be open-minded and not closed-minded. It's good to not assume that somebody else is wrong and full of shit or crazy or evil just because they disagree with you. Does that seem about right? That's not at all the same thing as saying that everybody's entitled to their own opinion. That's just saying, keep an open mind. It's good to be polite and not harass other people. This doesn't necessarily mean that you don't share with them when you think they're wrong. You may save somebody's life by correcting a mistake. It's friendly to do this. Some of the most important duties that we have as friends are telling our friends the hard truths, right? Is telling them when we think that they're wrong and they're kind of doing things incorrectly. They're going down the wrong path. Perhaps they have spinach on their teeth. Perhaps their zipper is down. Perhaps they're dating the wrong person. Nobody ever listens to that shit though, right? Yeah, good luck. But I find it difficult to believe that it's rude to tell somebody that I disagree when some of the most important and caring sorts of actions that I have towards my friends and loved ones involves telling them that I think they're wrong. Now, I need to do this in a tactful way, right? I can't do it rudely. I can't do it in a harassing way. There are better and worse ways of telling somebody that their zipper is down. And that's important. And it's important to maybe be able to think for oneself. Maybe this is part of everybody's got a right to their own opinion. Is that we think that it's important that people should think for themselves. But this does not mean that whatever you think is automatically good for you, right? And just because you have an opinion doesn't mean it's a product of thinking for yourself. I don't know about you guys. Probably most of the shit bouncing around up here in my head, I got that from other people. From my parents, from the TV, from newspapers, from teachers, from preachers. A lot of my beliefs are not a product of my own thought. Is it better if they are? Yeah, maybe. But none of this is the same as saying that everybody has the right to their own opinion. Here's what I'll propose instead. Here's a whole big collection of possible statements that I think say what's behind the sentiment, the admirable sentiments behind everybody having a right to their own opinion. This does it much better. That's a lot of text. That's way too much text for a presentation slide. You can look at it at home on your own. Here's maybe a way of summing it up really quick in a way that we can kind of end class on this note. If being entitled to your opinion is going to mean something interesting, if your entitlement to your opinion means that I should respect it somehow, or that I should treat it as somehow on par with other opinions, then that needs to be earned. That respect is not automatically given. It needs to be earned. And the way that we earn the respect for our opinions, the way that we show that we ought to be taken seriously, is we give justificatory reasons for why this is believable. If you can give reasons, and those reasons are good, then the rest of us have a duty to respect those reasons. Not necessarily to agree with you, but to treat it as good, that's a respectable thing to think because they had reasons. We also have a duty to hear people out. If somebody disagrees with us, I should give you a chance. If I really want to push this and kind of raise the bar for your duty to other people when you disagree with them, I might even say that you have more than a duty to hear them out. You maybe have a duty to help them out. If they're giving reasons and it seems like they're bumbling through it, you might want to say something like, I think the argument that you want to make is this, right? That's a very polite way of disagreeing with somebody, to help them find the best possible version. And if I really want to push this, and I think this is actually fairly important, this is maybe the most important thing, is when I encounter somebody with whom I disagree, and I recognize that I have a duty to at least hear their reasons out, and maybe even help them come up with better reasons than the ones they already have, I think I also have a duty to entertain the possibility, at least the possibility, that in this disagreement, I might be the one who's wrong. And I might be the one that needs to change my mind. If we can agree about all this, then I think we're cool for the rest of the semester, more or less. If there's anybody who's wants to hold out on this and I'm not ready yet, I'm not ready to give this up, let me know. I want to hear your objections to it, because if we disagree, there's at least the possibility in principle, right, that I'm the one who's wrong, and I need to hear your reasons. Thanks. I'll see you guys on Wednesday. No new homework between now and then.